the woman who stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Riverton, Wyoming on that scorching August afternoon in 1876, carried nothing but a leather satchel and secrets that could make a person rich beyond measure or dead before sundown. Her dark hair clung to her neck beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her green eyes scanned the wooden storefronts with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail, every face, every shadow where danger might lurk. The handful of townsfolk who noticed her arrival would later recall how she moved with purpose, despite the exhaustion that lined her delicate features, how her cotton dress bore the dust of 1,000 miles, and how she gripped that satchel like it contained the last precious thing on earth. Riverton sprawled along the Little Wind River, a collection of false-fronted buildings and ambitious dreams that had sprung up after the Union Pacific Railroad brought civilization and commerce westward. The town smelled of sawdust, horse manure, and possibility. Saloons competed with general stores for space along the main thoroughfare, while the blacksmith's hammer rang out a steady rhythm that underscored the constant murmur of human activity. In the distance, the Wind River Mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks still crowned with snow even in the heat of summer. The woman's name was Rose Bailey, though she had traveled under 3 different names since leaving Richmond 6 weeks earlier. At 23 years old, she had already buried a father, fled a burning city, and devoted the last decade of her life to a single obsession that most people would dismiss as fantasy or folly. The map tucked inside her satchel represented everything her father had died protecting, everything the Confederacy had lost, and everything she needed to reclaim a future that war had stolen from her family. She made her way to the only hotel in town, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and windows that looked out over the main street. The clerk behind the desk was a middle-aged man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, and he studied her with the kind of suspicious curiosity that strangers often encountered in small western towns. "I need a room," Rose said, her Virginia accent softened by years of conscious effort to blend in wherever necessity took her. "Just for a few nights while I conduct some business." "Business?" The clerk's eyebrows rose. Not many women traveling alone on business through these parts. "What kind of business might that be?" "The private kind," Rose replied, placing coins on the scarred wooden counter. "Will this cover 3 nights?" The clerk swept the money into his palm with practiced efficiency. "Room 7, top of the stairs. Breakfast is at 6 if you want it, costs extra. There's a bathhouse out back if you want to wash off the trail." Rose took the key he offered and climbed the narrow staircase, her muscles aching from days of being jolted in stage coaches across an unforgiving landscape. The room was small but clean, with a bed that looked reasonably comfortable, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a single window that provided a view of the stable yard. She set her satchel on the bed and locked the door before allowing herself to sink onto the mattress with a sigh that carried weeks of tension. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the satchel and withdrew the oilcloth bundle that contained the map. She had memorized every line, every landmark, every cryptic notation that her father had made in the margins, but she still needed to verify that the landscape matched what he had drawn. According to his notes, the gold had been buried somewhere in the foothills northwest of what would become Riverton, hidden by 3 Confederate officers who had fled west after the war with a fortune meant to fund a Southern resurgence that never materialized. 2 of those officers had died in the intervening years, and the 3rd had ended up in her father's care during his final days, delirious with fever and guilt, spilling secrets to a doctor who had once worn the same gray uniform. Rose's father had spent years trying to verify the story, following leads across the South, until a gang of former Union soldiers who had heard rumors of his search had beaten him to death in an alley in Memphis. Rose had found his body, found his notes, and found a purpose that burned brighter than grief. She would locate the gold, and she would use it to build something lasting, something that would honor her father's memory and prove that his death had not been meaningless. But first, she needed help. The map indicated terrain that she could not navigate alone, and despite her determination, Rose was practical enough to recognize her limitations. She needed someone who knew this country, someone who could handle the physical demands of the search, and someone she could trust enough to share the secret without fearing betrayal. That last requirement seemed nearly impossible to fulfill, which was why she had been watching the streets of Riverton from her window for the better part of an hour, studying the people who passed below. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains when she finally saw someone who caught her attention. He was tall and lean, moving with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin and the environment around him. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowhand, denim and leather worn soft from use, with a hat that shaded a face she could not quite make out from her vantage point. What drew her notice was the way he paused to help an elderly woman carry a heavy crate from a wagon to the general store, refusing what appeared to be an offer of payment with a shake of his head and a touch to his hat brim. The gesture was small, but it suggested character, and character was what Rose needed almost as much as she needed skill. She watched him enter the saloon across the street, and after a moment's hesitation, she freshened her appearance as best she could and made her way downstairs. The respectable women of Riverton would not frequent a saloon, but Rose had long since stopped worrying about maintaining conventions that had died along with the Old South. She pushed through the swinging doors into a dim interior that smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and male sweat. Conversation faltered as heads turned to observe her entrance. Rose ignored the stares and the muttered comments, focusing instead on locating the tall cowboy. She found him at the bar, a glass of amber liquid in front of him, his attention on the bartender who appeared to be sharing some piece of local gossip. Up close, she could see that he was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of strong coffee. His face was tanned from long hours in the sun, with the kind of lean, angular features that suggested both strength and intelligence. Rose approached with more confidence than she felt. "Excuse me, I'm looking for someone who knows the country northwest of here, someone familiar with the foothills." The cowboy turned to look at her, and she saw surprise flicker across his face before it settled into polite attention. "That covers a lot of territory, miss. Might help if you could be more specific about what you're looking for." "I need a guide," Rose said quietly, aware of the ears that were undoubtedly straining to hear their conversation. "Someone reliable and discreet. I'm prepared to pay well." One dark eyebrow rose. "A guide to where exactly? Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private." The cowboy studied her for a long moment, and Rose had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed and catalogued with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for livestock at auction. Finally, he nodded. "Name's Dalton Reed. I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of town. We could talk there if you're willing to ride out." "I don't have a horse," Rose admitted. "I've got 2. We can ride together if you trust me enough to get on a horse with a stranger." Rose smiled despite herself. "You just asked me to trust you enough to ride out to an isolated ranch with you." A shared horse seems a minor concern by comparison, something that might have been appreciation glinted in Dalton's eyes. "Fair point. Give me a minute to settle up here and we'll go." 20 minutes later, Rose found herself seated behind Dalton on a sturdy bay gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist as they left the town behind. The horse moved at an easy lope that covered ground quickly, and Rose tried not to think about how long it had been since she had been this close to any man, let alone a complete stranger. Dalton smelled like leather and sage, and she could feel the play of muscles in his back as he guided the horse with subtle shifts of weight and pressure. The ranch, when they reached it, was modest but well-maintained. A small house with a covered porch sat near a barn and a corral where several horses watched their approach with mild interest. A creek ran through the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided shade and the pleasant sound of running water. It was the kind of place that spoke of hard work and careful planning, and Rose felt some of her tension ease at the evidence of stability. Dalton helped her dismount, his hands strong and careful at her waist, before tending to the horse. Rose waited on the porch, watching as he worked with the efficient movements of long practice. When he finally joined her, he gestured toward the door. "Come on in. I'll make coffee and you can tell me what this is really about." The interior of the house was sparse but clean, with furniture that looked handmade and sturdy. Dalton busied himself with the stove and coffee pot while Rose settled into a chair at the rough wooden table. She waited until he had poured them both cups of strong, bitter coffee before she began. "What I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us," she said. "I'm trusting you with information that could be valuable or dangerous, depending on how it's handled." Dalton leaned against the counter, cradling his cup. "I'm listening." Rose took a breath and made her decision. "I have a map that shows the location of Confederate gold buried in the foothills. A substantial amount of gold. I need someone to help me find it and recover it." She had expected skepticism, perhaps laughter, maybe outright dismissal. Instead, Dalton's expression remained thoughtful. "Confederate gold. There have been stories about that for years. Most people figure they're just stories." "Most people are right," Rose said, "but not about this one. My father was a doctor during the war. One of the officers who buried the gold ended up in his care dying and told him everything. My father spent years verifying the information, and he was killed for it by men who wanted the secret for themselves." "I'm sorry about your father," Dalton said, and the sincerity in his voice surprised her. "But if someone killed him for this information, what makes you think you'll be safer?" "I don't think I'll be safer," Rose said quietly. "I think I'll be more successful. My father was trying to do this alone, and he was asking questions in the wrong places. I'm going to go straight to the source, recover what's there, and disappear before anyone knows what I've found." "And you want me to help you dig up buried treasure?" Dalton shook his head, but there was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's not something I hear every day." "I'm serious about paying you," Rose said. "A percentage of whatever we find. 10%. 25, Dalton countered. 15, and I'll throw in whatever supplies we need for the expedition. 20, and I provide the horses and equipment." Rose considered. 20% was more than she had wanted to offer, but Dalton seemed capable and trustworthy, and those qualities were worth paying for. 20%. But I need your word that this stays between us, and that you won't try to cheat me out of my share." Dalton crossed the room and extended his hand. "You have my word, Rose Bailey, though I'm curious how you know that's really your name." "It is my real name," Rose said, shaking his hand. His grip was warm and firm. "I've used others for traveling, but I figure if we're going to be partners in this, we should at least be honest about our names." "Partners," Dalton repeated. "I like the sound of that. So when do we start looking?" "Dawn," Rose said. "I want to start at dawn tomorrow." "Can you be ready that quickly?" "I've been running this ranch alone for 3 years," Dalton said. I can be ready in 3 hours if need be, but dawn's better. The light in these mountains can play tricks on you if you're not careful, and we'll want to be able to see what we're doing." They spent the next hour going over the map together, with Dalton identifying landmarks and offering suggestions about the best routes into the foothills. He asked intelligent questions about the markings and notations, and Rose found herself relaxing in his presence. There was something steady about him, something that inspired confidence without arrogance. He listened when she spoke, considered her opinions, and treated her like a partner rather than a nuisance or a commodity. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Dalton saddled the horse again to take Rose back to town. The ride back was quieter, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what the morning might bring. When they reached the hotel, Dalton helped her down from the horse with the same careful courtesy he had shown earlier. "Get some rest," he said. "I'll meet you here at dawn with the horses and supplies. Dress practical. Where we're going, there won't be any use for fancy clothes or delicate sensibilities." "I think I left those behind in Richmond," Rose said, "along with everything else from my old life." Dalton's expression softened. "Maybe you'll find a new life out here. Wyoming's got a way of giving people fresh starts if they're willing to work for them." Rose watched him ride away into the gathering darkness, then made her way upstairs to her room. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the town settling into night, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake by trusting a stranger with her father's secret. But something in her gut told her that Dalton Reed was exactly the kind of man she needed, and Rose had learned to trust her instincts when it came to judging character. Dawn arrived with a gradual lightening of the sky from black to deep blue to pale gray. Rose was already dressed and waiting on the hotel porch when Dalton rode up leading a second horse, a pretty sorrel mare with a gentle eye. He had packed supplies onto both animals, bedrolls and saddlebags that suggested he was prepared for an extended trip. "Morning," he said, touching his hat. "This is Clementine. She's got a sweet disposition and she won't throw you, even if you're not much of a rider." "I can ride well enough," Rose said, though in truth it had been years since she had spent any significant time on horseback. "How far are we going?" "According to your map, we're looking at maybe a day and a half of riding to get to the general area. Then it depends on how accurate your father's information was, and how good we are at reading the landscape." Rose mounted Clementine with only a little awkwardness, settling into the saddle with determination if not grace. Dalton watched to make sure she was secure, then turned his bay gelding north and set a pace that covered ground without exhausting the horses. They left Riverton behind as the sun climbed above the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The land rolled away in all directions, sage-covered plains giving way gradually to pine-dotted foothills as they approached the mountains. The morning air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth. Rose found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride, her body remembering skills she had thought forgotten. Dalton proved to be an easy companion, pointing out features of the landscape and sharing stories about the country they were passing through. He had been born in Texas, he told her, and had worked cattle drives up from the Gulf all the way to the railheads in Kansas before deciding he wanted to put down roots somewhere permanent. Wyoming had called to him with its wide skies and mountain vistas, and he had claimed his ranch through a combination of saved wages and sheer stubborn determination. "What about you?" he asked as they paused to water the horses at a creek. "What was your life like before all this?" Rose considered how much to share. "My father was a good man, a doctor, like I said. We lived in Richmond, and during the war he treated anyone who needed help, regardless of which uniform they wore. After the war, things were hard. He kept looking for ways to rebuild, to create something good out of all the destruction. When he heard about the gold, I think he saw it as a chance to fund hospitals, schools, things that would help people who had nothing left. Noble goals, Dalton said. He was a noble man. Rose's voice caught slightly. He deserved better than to die in an alley, beaten to death by men who wanted to steal his dreams. Dalton was quiet for a moment. And what will you do with the gold if we find it? Same things your father planned, some of it, Rose said. I want to honor his memory. But I also want to build a life for myself, something stable and permanent. I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. Money might not buy happiness, but it can buy security, and right now that seems almost as valuable. They remounted and continued north, the terrain growing steadily more rugged as they climbed into the foothills. Pine trees replaced sage, and the air grew cooler with altitude. Dalton led them off the main trails, following game paths and his own knowledge of the country. He consulted the map several times, comparing its markings to the landscape around them. By late afternoon, they had reached a narrow valley between two ridges, with a creek running through it and a meadow that provided good grazing for the horses. Dalton called a halt for the day, declaring that they would make camp and spend the remaining daylight scouting the surrounding area. Rose helped him set up camp, following his instructions for gathering firewood and arranging their supplies. He showed her how to hobble the horses so they could graze without wandering, and together they built a fire ring from stones collected along the creek. The domestic nature of the tasks felt oddly comfortable, and Rose realized she was enjoying the simple pleasure of working alongside someone competent and kind. As twilight settled over the valley, they sat by the fire eating beans and bacon that Dalton had cooked in a battered skillet. The food was plain but satisfying, and Rose ate with better appetite than she had experienced in weeks. The stress that had knotted her shoulders since leaving Richmond seemed to ease in the peaceful surroundings. "Tell me about the map," Dalton said, wiping his plate clean with a piece of hardtack. "What exactly are we looking for?" Rose retrieved the map from her saddlebag and spread it on the ground between them, using stones to hold down the corners. In the firelight, the markings seemed to take on new significance. "My father's notes say we're looking for a rock formation that resembles a cathedral or church. There should be a split rock with a distinctive profile, and somewhere near it, a cave or overhang where the gold was hidden." "Cathedral rocks aren't uncommon in this country," Dalton said, studying the map. "But the combination of features might narrow it down. Tomorrow we'll start searching in a grid pattern. It'll be slow work, but thorough." They talked late into the night, the conversation drifting from practical matters to personal histories and dreams. Rose found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, stories about her childhood, her fears, her hopes for a future that had seemed impossibly distant until now. Dalton listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering his own experiences in return. She learned that he had left Texas after his parents died of fever, that he had a younger sister married to a shopkeeper in Denver, and that he had always dreamed of building something lasting on his ranch. He wanted to raise horses, he told her, not just the practical working stock he had now, but fine animals that would be sought after throughout the territory. It was a modest dream compared to the grand ambitions she had heard from other men, but its very modesty made it appealing. When they finally settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Rose lay awake watching the stars wheel overhead. She could hear Dalton's steady breathing, the crackle of the fire, the distant call of a night bird. Despite the strangeness of sleeping rough in the wilderness, she felt safer than she had in months. Something about Dalton's presence was reassuring, and she drifted into sleep with a sense of cautious optimism. The next 3 days fell into a pattern of methodical searching. They would wake at dawn, eat a quick breakfast, and then spend the daylight hours combing the foothills for anything that matched the map's description. Dalton taught Rose to read the landscape, to look for the subtle signs that indicated promising areas to investigate. They scrambled over rocky slopes, pushed through dense pine groves, and explored dozens of formations that initially seemed promising but ultimately proved to be dead ends. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally. Rose's muscles ached from the constant climbing and scrambling, and her hands grew calloused from pulling herself up steep slopes. But she also found herself growing stronger, more capable, more confident in her ability to handle the challenges the search presented. And through it all, Dalton was a constant source of support and encouragement, never condescending, always treating her like an equal partner. They were exploring a particularly rugged section of the foothills on the 4th day when Rose spotted something that made her heart leap. A rock formation rose from the slope ahead, its profile suggesting the spire and buttresses of a cathedral. She grabbed Dalton's arm, pointing. "There, do you see it?" Dalton followed her gaze, his expression sharpening with interest. "I see it. Let's get closer." They scrambled up the slope, excitement lending speed to their movements. The formation grew more impressive as they approached, a natural sculpture carved by wind and water over countless centuries. The main spire rose perhaps 40 feet, with smaller formations clustered around its base like a congregation of worshippers. And there, on the eastern side, a massive boulder split by some ancient force created a distinctive V-shape that matched perfectly with a notation on the map. Rose's hands shook as she pulled out the map to verify the match. "This is it. This has to be it. The cave should be somewhere near the base, probably on the north side where it would be protected from weather." They circled the formation, examining every crevice and overhang. It was Dalton who finally found it, a narrow opening partially concealed by a rockfall that looked natural but might have been deliberately arranged. He called Rose over, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Look here. Someone's moved these rocks, probably years ago, but you can still see where they don't quite fit the surrounding pattern." Together they began clearing the rocks away, working carefully to avoid causing a larger collapse. The opening behind the rockfall was small, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but when Dalton held a torch inside, they could see that it opened into a larger space beyond. "I'll go first," Dalton said. "Make sure it's stable before you follow." Rose watched anxiously as he wormed his way through the opening, the torch casting strange shadows on the surrounding rock. Long moments passed before she heard his voice, muffled but clear. "Rose, you need to see this." She followed him through the narrow passage, scraping her shoulders on the rough stone despite her best efforts to stay small. The cave beyond was perhaps 10 feet across, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright. And there, stacked against the far wall, were wooden crates bearing the stamps and markings of the Confederate States of America. Rose's breath caught in her throat. After all the searching, all the doubt, all the fear that her father's information had been wrong or that someone else had already found the cache, here it was. Real. Tangible. Proof that everything she had believed was true. Dalton set the torch in a crack in the stone wall and approached the crates cautiously. He tried to lift one, then whistled low. "These are heavy. Whatever's inside, there's a lot of it." Using a knife from his belt, he pried at the lid of the nearest crate until it came free with a shriek of protesting nails. Inside, gleaming in the torchlight, were gold coins and bars packed in straw. The wealth represented by that single crate was staggering, and there were at least a dozen more crates stacked against the wall. Rose sank to her knees beside the open crate, her fingers trembling as she lifted one of the gold bars. It was solid and heavy, stamped with markings that identified its weight and purity. Her father had been right. He had died for this, and she had crossed a continent for this, and it was real. "Rose," Dalton's voice was gentle. "Are you all right?" She realized tears were streaming down her face. "My father died for this. He was beaten to death for chasing what everyone else thought was a fantasy, and he was right all along. I wish he could see this. I wish I could tell him that his search wasn't in vain." Dalton knelt beside her, his presence warm and solid. "He'd be proud of you for finishing what he started, for being brave enough to come out here alone, for seeing this through. That's a fine way to honor his memory." Rose wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "We found it. We actually found it." "We did," Dalton agreed. "Which means now we have a new problem. We need to figure out how to get it out of here and somewhere safe without attracting attention or getting ourselves killed in the process." The practical concern cut through Rose's emotional fog. He was right. Finding the gold was only the first step. Moving it, protecting it, and converting it into usable wealth would require careful planning and considerable discretion. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "How much do you think is here?" Dalton examined the crates, doing rough calculations. "If they're all like this one, I'd estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 worth of gold. Maybe more, depending on current prices." The figure was almost incomprehensible. Rose had known intellectually that the cash would be substantial, but hearing the actual amount made it seem simultaneously more real and more impossible. "We can't move that much gold by ourselves, not without making multiple trips. And every trip increases the risk that someone will notice what we're doing. We'll need to cache most of it closer to town," Dalton said thoughtfully. "Somewhere secure where we can guard it while we figure out the best way to convert it to currency. My ranch has a root cellar that would work, but getting the gold there without being seen will be tricky." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans and taking inventory. There were 15 crates in total, each containing a mixture of gold coins and bars. The coins were primarily double eagles and eagles, pre-war minting that would be easier to spend than the bars. The bars would need to be sold or traded through banks or assay offices, which would require careful handling to avoid suspicion. As the sun began to set, they reluctantly left the cave, carefully replacing the rocks to conceal the entrance. They would need to make multiple trips to retrieve the gold, and protecting the cache until they could empty it completely was crucial. Dalton used his knife to mark several trees near the site in subtle ways that would help them find it again, but wouldn't be obvious to casual observers. The ride back to their camp was quiet, both of them processing what they had found and what it meant for their futures. The euphoria of discovery was fading into the sobering reality of the challenges ahead. Rose found herself wondering how many people had died chasing Confederate gold over the years. How many more might die if word of their find became public knowledge? That night, they sat by the fire discussing logistics and security. Dalton suggested they spend the next several days ferrying the gold from the cave to his ranch, taking only 1 or 2 crates at a time to avoid suspicion. They would claim to be prospecting if anyone asked, showing off a few nuggets Dalton had from an earlier mining venture as proof of their activities. Once the gold was safely at the ranch, they could take their time deciding how best to liquidate it. "I'll need to trust you completely," Rose said. "Once that gold is on your property, you could easily decide to keep it all for yourself." Dalton met her eyes across the fire. "I gave you my word, Rose. That means something to me. Besides, I've spent enough time with you now to know that cheating you would be about the lowest thing I could do. You've worked too hard for this, lost too much for this. I won't be the one who takes it from you." Something in his voice, in his eyes, made Rose's heart quicken. Over the past few days, she had come to respect Dalton's competence and appreciate his company. But now she felt something deeper stirring. The way he looked at her, the care he took with her safety, the respect he showed for her intelligence and determination, all of it added up to something that felt dangerously like affection. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For believing me, for helping me, for treating me like a partner." "You are a partner," Dalton said. "In this, at least, though I've been thinking maybe we could be partners in more than just treasure hunting." Rose's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Dalton stood and moved around the fire to sit beside her. In the flickering light, his face was all planes and shadows, but his eyes were warm and earnest. "I mean that I've enjoyed these days with you more than I've enjoyed anything in a long time. You're smart and brave and determined, and you don't quit when things get hard. Those are qualities I admire. Hell, they're qualities I'd want in someone I was building a life with." "Dalton," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is sudden," he continued. "I know we've only known each other a few days. But out here, time moves different. You learn who people really are when you're depending on each other for survival, when there's no social niceties or pretense to hide behind. And I like who you are, Rose Bailey. I like you a lot." Rose's heart was hammering against her ribs. Part of her wanted to be cautious, to point out all the reasons why this was too fast, too risky, too complicated. But another part of her, the part that had been lonely for so long, responded to the sincerity in his voice and the warmth in his eyes. "I like you too," she admitted. "More than I expected to. More than is probably wise, given that we're in the middle of a very complicated situation." "Life's complicated," Dalton said. "Doesn't mean we can't find happiness in the middle of the complications." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Rose felt the contact like an electric current, awareness flooding through her. She had been touched so rarely in recent years, had allowed so few people close enough to even try. But Dalton's touch felt right in a way she couldn't quite articulate. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm suggesting that we see where this goes," Dalton said. "We've got shared goals already with the gold. We work well together. And unless I'm badly misreading things, there's an attraction here that goes beyond simple partnership." Rose couldn't deny it. She was attracted to him, had been since she first watched him help that elderly woman in Riverton. But attraction was one thing. Building a life together was something else entirely. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. After everything I've been through, after everything I've lost, the idea of opening my heart to someone terrifies me." "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow," Dalton said, a smile playing at his lips. "I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that maybe we could build something good together. Take it slow, see what develops, be honest with each other about what we're feeling." Rose looked at their joined hands, then up into his face. There was such kindness there, such genuine care. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way, had treated her like something precious worth protecting. "All right," she said. "We'll see where this goes, but slowly. I need time to trust this, to trust you, to trust myself." "Slowly is good," Dalton said. Then, moving with careful deliberation, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, respectful and sweet, asking rather than demanding. Rose felt herself melting into it, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. The kiss deepened slightly, warmth blooming between them before Dalton pulled back with obvious reluctance. "That was nice," Rose said, somewhat breathlessly. "Very nice," Dalton agreed. "And now I think we should probably get some sleep, because tomorrow we start the hard work of moving the gold and we're going to need our strength." They settled into their bedrolls, but this time Rose felt hyper-aware of Dalton's presence across the fire. Sleep was a long time coming, her mind spinning with thoughts of gold and kisses and the possibility of a future she had never let herself imagine. The next morning dawned clear and cool. They ate a quick breakfast and then rode back to the Cathedral Rocks, both of them focused and businesslike, despite the new layer of awareness humming between them. At the cave, they worked together to load 2 of the crates onto packhorses Dalton had brought for that purpose, securing them carefully and covering them with canvas and supplies to disguise their true cargo. The journey back to Riverton was tense, both of them watching for any sign that they were being observed or followed. But the trails remained empty except for occasional wildlife, and they reached Dalton's ranch without incident as the sun reached its zenith. Dalton's root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the floor of his house, a deep space lined with stone that stayed cool year-round. They manhandled the heavy crates down the ladder, stacking them in a corner and covering them with old blankets and baskets of preserved vegetables that made the space look like nothing more than a well-stocked larder. "That's 2 down, 13 to go," Dalton said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "At this rate, it'll take us better than a week to move everything." "Can you afford to be away from your ranch that long?" Rose asked. "The horses can manage for a few days at a time. I'll have one of my neighbors check on them, tell him I'm helping a friend with some prospecting. He'll think I'm chasing fool's gold, but he'll keep an eye on things for me." They fell into a routine over the following days. Each morning they would ride out to the cave, load what they could carry, and bring it back to the ranch. Each evening they would secure the day's haul in the root cellar, eat dinner together, and spend the quiet hours talking and learning about each other. And each night, before they retired to their separate sleeping arrangements, Dalton would kiss Rose with increasing warmth and tenderness. Rose felt herself falling for him more deeply with each passing day. The way he made her laugh, the consideration he showed for her comfort, the partnership they had developed in their work together, all of it combined to create something that felt increasingly like love. She found herself watching him when he wasn't aware of it, admiring the way he moved, the competence of his hands, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. On the 7th day, as they were securing the last of the crates in the root cellar, Rose realized that the gold no longer seemed like the most important thing she had found in Wyoming. Dalton was laughing at something she had said, his face alight with genuine amusement, and she felt her heart turn over in her chest with a wave of affection so strong it almost frightened her. "What?" he asked, catching her staring. "I was just thinking," Rose said slowly, "that my father would have liked you. He always said the measure of a man was how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him. You've been kind and respectful to me from the beginning, before you knew about the gold, before you knew what I could offer you. That says something about your character." Dalton's expression softened. "Your good opinion means a lot to me, Rose, more than the gold if I'm being honest." "More than 20% of $200,000, Rose teased. "More than all of it," Dalton said seriously. "I want the money, I won't lie about that. It'll help me build the kind of ranch I've been dreaming about. But what I want more is you. I want mornings that start with your face across the breakfast table and evenings that end with you in my arms. I want to build something lasting with you, Rose. Not just a business partnership, but a real life together." Rose felt tears prick at her eyes. "I want that too. I didn't think I would, didn't think I could after everything I've lost. But you've made me believe in new beginnings, in the possibility of happiness again." Dalton crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. This kiss was different from the previous ones, deeper and more passionate, carrying the weight of emotion and promise. Rose wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the longing and hope that had been building in her heart. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Rose. Not because of the gold, not because we make good partners in treasure hunting, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." "Yes," Rose said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." They celebrated that night with a bottle of whiskey Dalton had been saving for a special occasion, toasting their engagement and their future. The gold sat secure in the root cellar below them, but it had ceased to be the center of their focus. Instead, they talked about the life they would build together, the home they would make, the dreams they would pursue as partners in every sense of the word. Over the next several weeks, they worked together to convert the gold into more manageable assets. Dalton made trips to various banks and assay offices in different towns, selling off small amounts at a time to avoid arousing suspicion. The coins were easier to handle than the bars, and they agreed to keep a substantial portion of the wealth in gold as a hedge against future uncertainty. Rose moved into the ranch house, and they were married by a circuit preacher who came through Riverton in late September. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church with a handful of Dalton's neighbors as witnesses. Rose wore a new dress purchased with some of their newfound wealth, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Dalton wore a suit that made him look uncomfortably formal, but the joy in his face when she walked down the aisle toward him made her heart sing. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, an exploration of passion and trust that left them both breathless and amazed. Rose had never imagined that physical intimacy could be so wonderful, so connected to the emotional bond they had built. In Dalton's arms, she felt cherished and safe, loved in a way that made her previous loneliness seem like a distant nightmare. They spent the winter making improvements to the ranch, using their wealth to purchase better stock, expand the facilities, and build a proper barn that would shelter horses through the harshest weather. Dalton began acquiring the breeding stock he had always dreamed of, fine animals with excellent bloodlines that would form the foundation of a respected horse breeding operation. Rose discovered she had a talent for the business side of ranching, managing the books and negotiating contracts with a sharp mind that impressed the men she dealt with, even if they were sometimes surprised to find themselves bargaining with a woman. She also began making good on her father's dreams, quietly funding a small hospital in Riverton and establishing a scholarship fund for young people who wanted to study medicine. Spring arrived with a rush of green growth and new life. Rose realized she was pregnant in April, when the morning sickness that had been plaguing her for weeks finally made sense. Dalton was overjoyed at the news, treating her like she was made of spun glass, until she laughingly told him she was having a baby, not dying of consumption, and he needed to let her continue doing her work. Their son was born in December of 1877, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Samuel, after Rose's father, and the joy of holding that tiny life in her arms made Rose weep with a complex mixture of happiness and grief. Her father would never meet his grandson, but his legacy lived on in the child, and in the good works Rose continued to fund with the Confederate gold. Dalton proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Samuel when he cried at night, changing nappies without complaint, and gazing at the baby with such obvious wonder that Rose fell in love with him all over again. Watching him with their son, She marveled at how far she had come from the desperate, grieving woman who had arrived in Riverton with nothing but a map and a dangerous dream. The ranch thrived over the following years. Dalton's horses developed a reputation for quality throughout Wyoming and beyond, and buyers came from as far away as California to purchase his stock. Rose expanded her charitable work, founding a school for children whose families couldn't afford the fees charged by the private academy in town. She taught some of the classes herself, finding joy in sharing knowledge with young minds eager to learn. In the summer of 1879, Rose gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Catherine. She had her mother's delicate features but her father's steady disposition, a calm baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the world with solemn eyes. Samuel, now a rambunctious toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything from feeding to bathing. The family settled into a rhythm of work and love, building something solid and lasting. Rose never forgot the journey that had brought her to Wyoming, the loss and pain that had driven her to seek the Confederate gold. But those memories became softer over time, transformed from sharp grief into a bittersweet acknowledgement of how far she had traveled, both literally and metaphorically. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised Rose with a gift. He led her out to the barn where a beautiful mare stood in one of the stalls, a gray with dappled markings and intelligent eyes. "She's yours," Dalton said. "I know you've been riding whatever horse was available, making do with the old stock. But you deserve your own mount, something as fine and spirited as you are." Rose ran her hand along the mare's neck, feeling the warm softness of her coat. "She's beautiful. What's her name?" "That's up to you," Dalton said. "She's your horse. You get to name her." Rose thought for a moment. "Hope. I want to call her Hope, because that's what you gave me when I had lost everything else." Dalton put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You gave me hope too, Rose. Hope and love and a family I never knew I needed. Everything good in my life started the day you walked into that saloon and asked for a guide." They stood together in the quiet barn, watching the sunset paint the sky through the open door. Samuel and Catherine were in the house with a neighbor woman who helped with the children, safe and healthy and loved. The ranch spread around them, prosperous and growing. The Confederate gold that had brought them together was nearly gone, spent on dreams realized and charitable works that would continue to benefit people for years to come. "You ever regret it?" Rose asked quietly. "Coming with me on that crazy treasure hunt? You could have lived a simple life without all the complications the gold brought." "Not for a second," Dalton said firmly. "That gold might have brought us together, but it's not what kept us together. What we have, what we've built, that came from love and hard work and choosing each other every single day. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." Rose leaned into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid strength of his body against hers. "I love you, Dalton Reed. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "My treasure hunter, my partner, my wife." They walked back to the house hand in hand as the stars began to appear overhead. The same stars that had watched over them on that first night in the wilderness, when they were little more than strangers bound by a map and a dream. The path from that night to this one had been complicated and sometimes dangerous, but every step had been worth it for the life they had created together. Inside the house, Samuel rushed to greet them, chattering about the games he had played while they were gone. Catherine cooed from her cradle, waving tiny fists in the air. The neighbor woman gathered her things and headed home, wishing them a pleasant evening. Dalton built up the fire while Rose prepared dinner, moving around the kitchen with the ease of long familiarity. After the children were fed and put to bed, Dalton and Rose sat together on the porch, watching the moon rise over the mountains. The night was cool and clear, filled with the sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. Horses nickered softly in the barn, cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere an owl called out its haunting question to the night. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, his arm around Rose's shoulders. "I was thinking about my father," Rose said. "Wishing he could see what his search led to. Not just the gold, but everything that came after. This ranch, our children, the hospital and school, the life we've built. He would have been so proud." "He is proud," Dalton said gently. "Wherever he is, whatever comes after this life, I believe he knows what you've done. How you honored his memory and his dreams while building your own future. That's a powerful legacy, Rose." "Our legacy," Rose corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you. You could have dismissed me as a crazy woman with an impossible dream. Instead, you said let's dig at dawn, and you kept your word through everything that followed." Dalton chuckled. "Let's dig at dawn. I remember thinking you were probably insane, but there was something in your eyes that made me want to believe you. Best decision I ever made, saying yes to that adventure." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, wrapped in each other's warmth and the contentment of a day well spent. Eventually, Dalton stood and pulled Rose to her feet. "Come to bed," he said. "Tomorrow's another day of work, and I want to make the most of tonight." Rose smiled and let him lead her inside, pausing only to bank the fire and check on the children one last time. Samuel slept with the abandon of childhood, sprawled across his small bed with his stuffed horse clutched in one hand. Catherine was curled in her cradle, breathing softly, her tiny features relaxed in sleep. In their own bedroom, Rose and Dalton made love with the familiar passion of long married partners who still delighted in each other's bodies. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Rose's head on Dalton's chest, his hand stroking her hair in a soothing rhythm. "Tell me something," Rose said drowsily. "When you first saw me that day in the saloon, what did you really think?" Dalton was quiet for a moment, considering. "I thought you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and the bravest, walking into a saloon full of rough men like you owned the place. I thought you were probably going to be trouble, but the interesting kind of trouble. And I thought I wanted to know you better, wanted to find out what made a woman like you do something so daring. And now that you know me," Rose asked. "Now I know I was right about the beautiful and brave parts," Dalton said. "And you are definitely trouble, but the very best kind. The kind that makes life worth living." Rose laughed softly and kissed his chest. "You're not so bad yourself, Cowboy." They drifted into sleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The Confederate gold had brought them to this place, but it was love that had built the life they shared. Love that would sustain them through whatever the future held. The years continued to roll by like the seasons, each bringing its own joys and challenges. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the horses and wanted to spend every waking moment in the barn with his father. Catherine developed into a thoughtful child with her mother's love of books and learning, often found curled up with whatever volume she had borrowed from the small library Rose had assembled in the house. In 1882, Rose gave birth to their third child, another boy they named James. He was a happy baby with a sunny disposition, quick to laugh and slow to tears. The ranch house rang with the sounds of childhood, and Rose found herself grateful every day for the abundance in her life. The hospital in Riverton expanded, adding wings and hiring additional doctors. The school Rose had founded grew from a single room with a handful of students to a proper academy with multiple teachers, and a curriculum that rivaled anything available in larger towns. Rose served on the boards of both institutions, using her business acumen and the remaining gold funds to ensure they would continue operating long after she was gone. Dalton's horse breeding operation became one of the most successful in the territory. His animals were known for their strength, intelligence, and gentle temperament, making them ideal for both ranch work and family riding. He took enormous pride in his work, and Rose loved watching him with the horses, seeing the care and patience he brought to every interaction. They faced challenges, of course. A harsh winter in 1883 killed some of their stock, and they had to work hard to rebuild the herd. Samuel broke his arm falling from a horse when he was 8, and the hours Rose spent sitting by his bedside while he healed reminded her how precious and fragile life could be. There were droughts and early frosts, disagreements with neighbors, and the constant balancing act of managing a growing enterprise while raising 3 active children. But through it all, their love remained constant. They still made time for each other, stealing moments of privacy when the children were occupied, taking evening rides together when the weather permitted, sitting up late at night talking about dreams and memories and plans for the future. Their partnership, forged in the adventure of hunting treasure, had matured into something deeper and more resilient than either of them had imagined possible. On a warm summer evening in 1887, as they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a party that included friends, neighbors, and business associates from across the territory, Rose found herself watching Dalton across the crowded room. He was laughing at something one of the ranchers had said, his face lined now with the marks of sun and wind and laughter, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples. He looked up and caught her eye, and the smile he gave her was full of such love and warmth that she felt her breath catch. Later, when the guests had gone home and the children were in bed, they sat together on the porch as they had done so many times before. The moon was full, painting the landscape in silver and shadow, and the air was sweet with the scent of the wildflowers Rose had planted around the house. 10 years, Dalton said, shaking his head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you walked into that saloon. Other times it feels like you've been part of my life forever. Both are true, I think, Rose said. We packed a lot of living into these 10 years. Built a family, grew a business, made a real home together. My father used to say that the quality of life mattered more than the quantity, and I understand what he meant now. These years with you have been so rich, so full that they feel like several lifetimes compressed into one. Do you ever think about the gold? Dalton asked. Wonder what might have happened if we hadn't found it? Rose considered the question. Sometimes, but I don't think finding the gold was the most important thing that happened on that trip. Meeting you, falling in love with you, discovering that I could trust someone enough to build a life with them, those were the real treasures. The gold just made some things easier, let us build faster and help more people. But everything that truly matters, we would have found our way to it regardless. I like to think you're right, Dalton said. Though I'm grateful we didn't have to do it the hard way. Starting with a fortune in Confederate gold certainly gave us a head start. They sat in companionable silence, Rose's head on Dalton's shoulder, his arm around her waist. The night sounds of the ranch formed a familiar symphony, as comforting as a lullaby. This was home, Rose thought. Not just the physical place, though she loved every board and nail of the house they had improved over the years. But home was this feeling of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be with exactly who she was meant to be with. I was thinking, Dalton said slowly, that maybe it's time to tell the children about the gold. They're old enough now to understand, and it's part of their history. Samuel especially keeps asking questions about where we got the money to build the ranch the way we did. Rose had known this conversation would come eventually. What will we tell them? The truth, Dalton said simply. That their mother was the bravest woman I ever met, brave enough to cross a continent alone chasing a dream most people thought was impossible. That she found what she was looking for because she refused to give up, because she honored her father's memory by finishing what he started. That we found the gold together, and we used it to build not just our own fortune, but to help other people build better lives too. Those are good lessons for children to learn. You make it sound noble, Rose said with a slight smile, when really it was just a desperate woman trying to survive and find some meaning after loss. Maybe it was both, Dalton said. Desperation and nobility aren't mutually exclusive. You were desperate, yes, but you were also honorable. You could have kept all the gold for yourself, lived a life of pure luxury without a thought for anyone else. Instead, you used it to fund hospitals and schools to help people who had nothing. That's nobility in my book. Rose felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by his faith in her. I love you, Dalton Reed. I fall more in love with you every single day. The feeling is entirely mutual, Mrs. Reed, he said, tilting her face up to kiss her. The next morning, they gathered the children together and told them the story. Samuel, now 10 years old, listened with wide eyes, asking questions about every detail of the adventure. Catherine, 8, wanted to know about the map and whether they still had it. James, only 5, was more interested in the horses they had ridden and whether he could see them. Rose brought out the map, now carefully preserved in a wooden box along with some of the Confederate coins they had kept as mementos. The children passed the items around carefully, handling them with the reverence due to family treasures. Rose and Dalton answered their questions honestly, explaining about the war, about Rose's father, about the decision to use the gold for good works as well as their own prosperity. So we're rich because Mama found buried treasure, Samuel asked, trying to wrap his mind around the concept. We're comfortable because your mother was clever and brave, Dalton corrected. And because we both worked hard to build something lasting with the opportunity the gold provided. Money by itself doesn't mean much if you don't use it wisely and well. Can we go see where you found it? Catherine asked. The cathedral rocks and the cave. Rose and Dalton exchanged glances. Someday, Rose said. When you're older, we'll take you there and show you exactly where it was. But the important thing isn't the place or even the gold. It's what came after. It's the family we built and the life we've made together. The children seemed satisfied with that answer, though Rose suspected they would have many more questions as they grew older and understood more of the story's implications. But for now, they were content to examine the artifacts and imagine the adventure their parents had shared. That summer, they took a family trip into the mountains, camping in the foothills not far from where Rose and Dalton had made their first camps together 11 years earlier. They didn't go all the way to the cathedral rocks, saving that pilgrimage for when the children were older, but they explored the country and Rose told stories around the campfire about her first journey west. The children loved sleeping under the stars, learning to fish in the mountain streams, and hearing about the early days of their parents' courtship. Samuel peppered his father with questions about horsemanship and survival skills. Catherine wanted to learn about the plants and animals they encountered. James mostly wanted to play in the creek and chase butterflies, watching her family together in the wilderness that had witnessed the beginning of her life with Dalton. Rose felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had lost so much, had suffered so greatly, but all of that had led her here to this moment, to this perfect completeness. Her father would have loved seeing his grandchildren, would have been proud of the woman she had become, and the family she had created. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked quietly, coming to sit beside her while the children played nearby. "Just counting my blessings," Rose said, leaning into his side. "Thinking about how strange and wonderful life is, how the worst moments can lead to the best ones if we're brave enough to keep moving forward." "Your father would be proud of you," Dalton said, echoing her thoughts. "Of who you are, what you've built, how you've honored his memory." "I hope so," Rose said. "I like to think he's watching over us somehow, happy to see that his search led to all of this." They sat together while the children's laughter rang through the valley, while the sun painted the mountains in gold, while the creek sang its eternal song. This was the real treasure, Rose thought. Not gold coins or bars, but these moments of perfect peace and happiness, the love of a good man, the joy of healthy children, the satisfaction of a life well lived. The years continued their inexorable march. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Rose and Dalton grew older together with grace and gratitude. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, weathered illnesses and injuries, mourned the loss of friends, and celebrated the births of neighbors' children. They saw Wyoming achieve statehood in 1890, participated in local politics, and continued to invest in the community that had become their home. Samuel, as he grew into young manhood, showed a natural talent for working with horses that surpassed even his father's considerable skill. He could gentle the wildest mustang, could read a horse's mood and respond with exactly the right touch. When he turned 18 in 1889, Dalton made him a full partner in the horse breeding operation, recognizing that the future of the business would rest in his capable hands. Catherine developed her mother's love of learning and her father's practical intelligence. She announced at age 16 that she wanted to be a doctor, a declaration that surprised no one who knew her. Rose used her connections and resources to help Catherine gain admission to one of the few medical schools that accepted women students, sending her off with a mixture of pride and heartache. James proved to be the adventurer of the family, always pushing boundaries and seeking new experiences. He talked of seeing the ocean, of traveling to foreign countries, of adventures that made even his mother's treasure hunt seem tame by comparison. Rose recognized in him the same restless spirit that had driven her west, and she encouraged his dreams while teaching him the practical skills he would need to survive in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. In the spring of 1895, Rose and Dalton celebrated their 20th anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, just the two of them with the children now grown and pursuing their own paths. Dalton had grayed considerably, and there were deep lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. Rose's dark hair was threaded with silver, and her hands showed the marks of 2 decades of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had ridden into the wilderness together with nothing but a map and a dream. 20 years, Rose marveled. "When I think about everything we've seen and done and built together, it hardly seems possible that it all fit into just 20 years. Best 20 years of my life," Dalton said, raising his glass to her. "Here's to 20 more and then 20 more after that." "I'll drink to that," Rose said, clinking her glass against his. They made love that night with the tender passion of long-married partners who knew every inch of each other's bodies, every preference and pleasure point, every way to give and receive delight. Afterward, they lay talking until the small hours, reminiscing about their adventures and making plans for the future that stretched ahead. "You have any regrets?" Rose asked. "Anything you wish we had done differently?" Dalton thought for a long moment. "I wish we'd had more children. I would have liked a houseful, but I know how hard the pregnancies and births were on you. Still, it would have been something to have a dozen little ones running around." Rose laughed softly. 3 was quite enough for me, thank you very much, though I agree it would have been lovely to have more. What else? I wish I'd met your father, Dalton said seriously. I would have liked to shake his hand, to thank him for raising such an extraordinary daughter, to let him know that his sacrifice meant something. He would have liked you, Rose said with certainty. You're exactly the kind of man he would have wanted for me. Strong and kind and honorable. He used to say that character was the only thing worth judging a person by, and you have character in abundance. They drifted into sleep, still entwined, still connected by the bonds of love and shared history that had sustained them through 2 decades of marriage. The future remained uncertain, as it always did, but they would face it together, as they had faced everything else. The new century arrived with fanfare and celebration. Rose and Dalton, now in their late 40s, watched the transition from 1899 to 1900 with a mixture of nostalgia and hope. The world was changing rapidly, with new technologies and ideas transforming the landscape of American life. The Wild West they had known was slowly being tamed, replaced by increasing civilization and order. Samuel married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread in 1901, a lovely young woman named Margaret who fit perfectly into the family. Rose helped plan the wedding, finding joy in seeing her eldest son so clearly happy and well-matched. When Samuel and Margaret's first child was born in 1902, making Rose and Dalton grandparents for the first time, they marveled at the continuation of the family line and the legacy they had built. Catherine completed her medical training and returned to Wyoming to practice, opening a clinic in Riverton that served the surrounding community. She remained unmarried, devoted to her work and her patients, finding fulfillment in healing rather than domestic life. Rose was proud of her daughter's independence and dedication, even as she secretly hoped Catherine might someday find the kind of love Rose had found with Dalton. James traveled extensively throughout his 20s, sending letters from San Francisco, Seattle, and even Alaska during the gold rush years. His adventures rivaled anything from a dime novel, and Rose treasured his letters, reading and rereading them until the pages were soft with handling. He eventually returned to Wyoming in 1905, full of stories and ready to settle down, taking a position managing the ranch's expanding operations. The ranch itself had grown into one of the premier horse breeding operations in the entire region. Dalton's dream of raising fine horses had been realized beyond anything he had imagined that day. He first said yes to Rose's crazy proposition. The Reed name was synonymous with quality and integrity, and buyers came from across the country to purchase their stock. Rose continued her charitable work, expanding the hospital and school as resources allowed. The Confederate gold was long since spent, but the investments they had made with it continued to generate income that funded ongoing operations. She took pride in knowing that her father's unintentional legacy was improving lives and creating opportunities for people who might otherwise have none. In the summer of 1906, Rose and Dalton took their 3 grown children on the trip they had promised years earlier, riding out to the Cathedral Rocks to show them where the adventure had begun. The landmarks were still there, weathered but recognizable, and the cave remained hidden behind its rockfall concealment. They stood together, looking at the formation that had changed all their lives, and Rose felt the weight of history and memory pressing down on her. So much had flowed from this place, so many joys and sorrows and triumphs. She reached for Dalton's hand, and he took it without looking, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "This is where your mother made me rich beyond measure," Dalton said to the children. Not with gold, though there was plenty of that, but with love and partnership and family, Everything good in my life started right here. Our life started here, Rose corrected gently. Both our lives. We were different people before this place brought us together. Better people after. They built a small cairn at the site, a marker to commemorate the beginning of their shared journey. Each of them added stones, and Rose placed at the base one of the Confederate coins they had kept, burying it in the earth as a kind of offering to the past and all it had meant. As they rode back toward the ranch, Rose felt a sense of closure and completion. The circle had been completed, the story told in full. Whatever the future held, they had honored the past and built something lasting on its foundation. The years that followed were quieter, marked more by the rhythms of family life than by high adventure. Rose and Dalton became fixtures in Riverton society, respected elders whose opinions carried weight in community decisions. They watched their grandchildren grow, delighting in each new milestone and achievement. Dalton's health began to decline in 1910, a gradual slowing that worried Rose even as he insisted he was fine. She nursed him through several bouts of illness, refusing to let him see her fear that she might lose him. The thought of life without Dalton was unbearable, a prospect that made her previous losses seem almost manageable by comparison. But he rallied each time, too stubborn and ornery to give up without a fight. And in the good days between the illnesses, they made the most of their time together, taking short rides when he was up to it, sitting on the porch for hours talking and watching the sunset, making love with careful tenderness that acknowledged the fragility of their aging bodies while celebrating the enduring passion between them. In the spring of 1912, as they sat together watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard, Dalton turned to Rose with a serious expression. "I want you to promise me something," he said. "Anything," Rose replied, feeling a flutter of anxiety at his tone. "When I'm gone, don't mourn too long. Don't let grief consume you the way it almost did after your father died. I want you to remember the joy we shared, the life we built, all the good times. And I want you to keep living, to keep finding happiness, to squeeze every drop of pleasure and purpose out of however many years you have left." "Dalton," Rose said, her voice breaking. "I mean it, Rose. You gave me more than I ever dreamed of having. You made me happier than I had any right to be. I want you to have that same happiness, even after I'm not here to share it with you." Rose was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "I can't imagine being happy without you. You're my whole world." "I'm part of your world," Dalton corrected gently. "A big part, I hope. But you've got children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who love you. You've got work that matters, people who depend on you. You've got so much life left to live, Rose. Don't waste it on grief." "I'll try," Rose promised, though she couldn't imagine actually doing what he asked. "But you're not dying any time soon. You're too stubborn for that." Dalton laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "I'll do my best to stick around, but we've had 34 good years, Rose. That's more than most people get. If my number comes up tomorrow, I'll go grateful for every moment we had together." He didn't die the next day, or the next month, or even that year. He lived to see Samuel's children marry and start families of their own. He lived to see Catherine's clinic expand again, serving an even larger community. He lived to see James settle completely into ranch management, bringing new ideas and energy to the operation. And then, on a quiet October evening in 1915, with Rose sitting beside his bed holding his hand, Dalton Reed closed his eyes for the last time and slipped peacefully away. The grief was crushing, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to imagine continuing. Rose wanted to crawl into bed beside his cold body and simply stop existing, to follow him wherever he had gone rather than face a world without his presence in it. But his words echoed in her mind, his plea that she not waste her remaining time on grief, and she forced herself to honor his last request. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Wyoming. Ranchers and businessmen, doctors and teachers, people from every walk of life came to pay their respects to a man who had been respected and loved throughout the territory. They shared stories of Dalton's kindness, his integrity, his skill with horses, and his dedication to his family. And Rose stood through it all with her children and grandchildren around her, accepting condolences and trying to find comfort in the knowledge that Dalton had been so well loved. The months after his death were the hardest of Rose's life, harder even than the aftermath of her father's murder. At least then she had had purpose, had had the treasure hunt to focus her grief and anger into productive action. Now she had nothing but emptiness and the constant ache of missing him. She would turn to share some observation only to remember he wasn't there. She would reach for him in the night and find only cold sheets. She would see something that would make him laugh, and the realization that she could never make him laugh again would hit her like a physical blow. But she survived, because survival was what she did. She threw herself into work, expanding the charitable operations, spending time with her grandchildren, helping manage the ranch. And slowly, painfully, she began to heal. The grief never went away entirely, but it became more manageable, transformed from a crushing weight into a bittersweet acknowledgement of how much she had loved and lost. On what would have been their 40th anniversary in 1917, Rose rode out alone to the Cathedral Rocks. She was 70 years old now, white-haired and stiff-jointed, but still capable of sitting a horse for the journey. At the cairn they had built together, she placed wildflowers and sat for a long time in quiet meditation. "We did it," she said aloud, speaking to Dalton's memory. "We found the gold, but more importantly, we found each other. We built something beautiful and lasting. Our children are thriving, our grandchildren are growing strong, and the legacy we created will continue long after I join you. You made me so happy, Dalton. I hope I did the same for you." She liked to think she felt his presence there, some whisper of his spirit acknowledging her words. But whether it was real or just wishful thinking didn't really matter. What mattered was that they had loved each other completely, had built a life together that honored both their dreams, had created something that would endure. Rose lived another decade, active and engaged despite her advancing age. She saw the end of the Great War, saw women win the right to vote, saw automobiles replace horses on the streets of Riverton. She held great-great-grandchildren in her arms and marveled at how far the family line had stretched from that day. She had stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a map and desperate hope. Catherine was with her when she died in 1927, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80. Her last words were about Dalton, something about seeing him at dawn, and Catherine liked to think her mother's last sight on earth had been her beloved husband waiting to take her home. They buried Rose next to Dalton on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The headstone bore both their names and a simple inscription: "Partners in adventure, partners in love, partners in building a legacy that endures." The ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, generation after generation carrying forward the values and vision that Rose and Dalton had established. The hospital and school they had funded grew and evolved, continuing to serve the community. And the story of the Confederate gold and the brave woman who had found it became part of family legend, passed down to each new generation as a reminder of where they had come from and what was possible when courage and love worked together. The gold itself was long gone, spent and dispersed into 1,000 different purposes. But the real treasure, the legacy of love and family and service that Rose and Dalton had created, that endured. It lived in their descendants, in the buildings and institutions they had funded, in the values they had modeled and the stories that kept their memory alive. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the sun painted the mountains in gold, ranch hands swore they could see two figures riding together through the foothills, a tall cowboy and a determined woman with a leather satchel, forever young, forever together, forever chasing dreams into the wild Wyoming dawn.